My name is Haley Carson. I was 34 years old and had spent most of my life in San Marcos, Texas, a small town where people smiled in church but whispered in grocery store aisles. In our family, I had always been the quiet daughter, not rebellious, not demanding, not particularly fragile, just quiet. My older brother Zach was the golden child. He followed in our father's footsteps and eventually took over the family's car dealership, a legacy passed down from our grandfather. Everyone in town knew his name. His photo hung in the local hardware store next to his Young Entrepreneur of the Year plaque. I used to pass it on my way to buy printer paper, pretending not to notice. Our mother was gentle, God-fearing, and unshakably devoted to a life of purpose through service. She ran charity drives, coordinated church luncheons, and believed, without irony, that a woman's greatest strength was in supporting the right man. She never said this to hurt me. It was simply the air she breathed, the truth she believed. I don't think she ever meant to overlook me. She just never looked too hard in the first place. From the time I was a teenager, I wanted to build something of my own. Not for attention, not to prove anyone wrong, but because I felt it. This restless pull to create. I didn't want a showroom or a stage. I wanted to work with ideas, help brands grow, and carve out my own small piece of the world. So I studied marketing at Texas State, took night jobs while I interned for free, and slowly, brick by brick, started building a business. When I moved to Austin in my late 20s and opened a tiny marketing firm in a converted bungalow, I sent an email to my family with a photo of the front door and a caption that read, "Day One." No one replied. Later, my mom said she thought it was just a project and asked if I'd found any clients yet. Zach told me the neighborhood I'd chosen was going downhill. My father asked if I needed money. I didn't. I needed them to see me, but I stopped hoping for that around the same time I learned how to write a contract by hand when the copier jammed. 5 years passed. My firm stayed small but steady. We worked with nonprofits, then startups, then, finally, real companies with payrolls and pressure. I hired 2 full-time staff and a freelance designer. I still answered the phone myself, still scrubbed the bathroom sink on Fridays. I didn't talk about it much to my family, not because I was ashamed, but because I knew they wouldn't understand the kind of success that didn't come with a plaque. In their eyes, I was still just Haley the good girl who helped clean up after parties and didn't ask for much, and I suppose I let that version of me survive around them. It was easier. It hurt less. I told myself I was being humble, but really, I was afraid of watching that familiar flicker of disinterest in their eyes one more time. Every summer, the Carson family hosted what we called the Carson Thanksgiving, a grand, slightly absurd tradition that took place not in November, but at the height of the Texas heat, usually in July, at my parents' lake house on Lake Travis. It was the kind of event people marked on their calendars months in advance, not because of sentiment, but because of status. Uncles, aunts, distant cousins, retired neighbors, former business partners of my father, and even old high school coaches would show up. It was less a reunion and more a showroom. Everyone paraded their lives like trophies. New trucks gleamed in the driveway, designer sunglasses sparkled on foreheads, and conversations floated like advertisements. Investment wins, property purchases, school acceptances, new clients, and growing net worths. Every year I skipped it. I always found an excuse: a project deadline, travel, a retreat. In truth, it was easier to stay away than to sit through 3 days of measured glances and polite nods, pretending I didn't notice how I had been cast as the outlier. The silent judgment was never overt, but it clung to me like humidity in the air, thick, cloying, impossible to ignore. I had long accepted that I was an afterthought at these gatherings, a minor subplot in a family novel written by men like my father and brother. But this year was different. A letter arrived in the mail, a formal invitation on heavy cardstock with a wax-stamped Carson crest. My father had always preferred ceremony over sincerity. The envelope contained a printed announcement. This year's event would be a celebration of legacy and succession, and he would be making a special announcement about the future of the family business. There was no hint of subtlety. It was a passing of the torch, and everyone knew who would be holding it. Still, I stared at that letter for days before deciding to go. Not because I had anything to prove to them, but because, for once, I had something that didn't need proving. My marketing firm, once a shaky operation in a converted house, now had a real address, real clients, and a team of 12 full-time employees. We had just secured a nationwide contract with a major pharmacy chain, a deal that would triple our revenue over the next fiscal year. I had spent the last 2 years working 12-hour days, burning through weekends, learning to delegate, learning to lead. I had survived what most small business owners didn't, the climb from survival to sustainability. No one in my family knew any of it. They didn't ask. I didn't offer. We'd built a kind of quiet understanding over the years. If I didn't speak too loudly about what I was doing, they wouldn't remind me that they thought it didn't matter. But now, standing on the edge of something bigger than I had ever accomplished, I felt a shift. Not anger, not revenge. Just the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your value doesn't depend on anyone seeing it. So I RSVP'd yes, and as I sealed the envelope and dropped it in the mailbox, I knew I wasn't just going back to Lake Travis. I was walking straight into a performance one I had skipped for too many years, and this time I was finally ready to stand on the stage. Not to be seen, but to stop hiding. I arrived in my old Chevy, the one with the faint scratch down the passenger side and the glove compartment that never quite shut all the way. I wore a simple navy dress I'd owned for years, nothing flashy, just something that made me feel clean and steady. As I pulled into the long gravel driveway of my parents' lake house, I could already feel the heat of old memories pressing in around me like the Texas sun. No one came running to greet me. There were no warm embraces, no exclamations of how long it had been. My brother Zach emerged from the garage, wiping grease from his hands with the hem of a branded apron that read, "Carson Auto Family Owned Since '72. He gave me a one-armed pat on the shoulder, like I was an out-of-town acquaintance, not his sister. His eyes didn't linger. He looked past me, checking the car, then the empty passenger seat, then back at the garage like he had more important things to get to. My parents stood on the front porch, smiling in that tight, performative way they'd perfected over decades of social hosting. My mother waved delicately, but as I walked up the steps, I saw her glance behind me, just briefly checking to see if I had brought anyone. There was always a hope I would finally arrive with someone acceptable on my arm, a man in a blazer, a ring on my finger, a story they could retell at church luncheons, but there was no one, just me. And I could see their disappointment trying to politely disguise itself behind practice nods and questions about my drive. Inside, the house looked almost unchanged. Same framed photos of Zach catching footballs. Same mounted newspaper articles about my father's early days in the dealership. Even the furniture arrangement hadn't shifted in years. It was like stepping into a carefully preserved family exhibit, except that I'd never quite fit into the curated story. The first few hours passed in a blur of handshakes, casserole dishes, and weather talk. I moved from room to room like a background character, smiling when spoken to, nodding at stories I'd already heard a dozen times. At one point, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror, shoulders pulled in, chin slightly tucked, expression politely blank. I didn't look 34, I looked 16, hoping to avoid being noticed for the wrong reasons. That evening, just before dinner, my father stood up to give a toast. He cleared his throat with a sound that demanded attention, and the room quieted. Glasses were raised in automatic sync. He began by thanking everyone for coming, then quickly pivoted to praise. He spoke of growth, of grit, of carrying the family legacy into the next generation. He spoke about Zach, his leadership, his vision, how proud he was of the man he'd become. He even called him the future face of Carson Auto, a man who understood what it meant to build something real. My name never came up. I wasn't surprised, but the absence still landed like a stone at the base of my throat. I lifted my glass with the others, smiled when the room applauded, and took a sip of wine that suddenly tasted metallic. I sat there in a room full of people I had known all my life and had never felt so invisible. My role, it seemed, had already been assigned and filed away, and no matter what I'd built outside those walls, within them, I was still the quiet daughter with soft hands and a job no one understood. The kind of person you nod at kindly before returning to the real celebration. The next morning, I woke up early and sat for a while by the window in the guest room, sipping coffee and listening to the low hum of cicadas outside. The lake shimmered just beyond the trees, and the house was still quiet, save for the occasional creak of old floorboards. I had planned this moment carefully. I wanted it to feel intentional, not impulsive. After all, this wasn't just a gesture, it was a declaration. I asked my parents to meet me on the back veranda after breakfast. It was shaded, cool, and private, with a view of the water. I thought maybe, just maybe, the setting might soften the edges of whatever came next. I handed them an envelope. Inside were three things: a series of printed emails from clients thanking me for campaigns that had changed the trajectory of their businesses, a glossy photo of my newly expanded office in Austin complete with our new signage, and a copy of the contract we had just signed with one of the largest pharmacy chains in the country. It was real, tangible success numbers, names, spaces, signatures. It had taken me years to get here. My mother opened the envelope first. She looked at the pages, slowly, quietly, as though they were part of a scrapbook she didn't quite remember. Her eyes moved over the text, but they didn't seem to register the words. She smiled politely, the same smile she used when someone brought an unfamiliar casserole to church potluck. Then she placed the papers neatly back into the envelope and set it on the table beside her, as if they were coupons she might or might not use. My father didn't even reach for the envelope. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and offered a non-committal grunt. Something about numbers on paper, the market being oversaturated, and how marketing was just one of those things that came and went. Then he said it. He didn't see how any of it translated into real value. Real value in his world meant inventory, steel, keys, and titles, tangible assets, cars you could touch and resell. He said it like a fact, like gravity, like there was no use arguing. I sat there nodding, smiling faintly, every muscle in my face working to keep the disappointment from spilling out. But it wasn't just disappointment. It was a cold, sharp awareness that this moment I had built up in my mind, the one where they would finally see me, was never going to arrive. Not because I hadn't earned it, but because they weren't capable of recognizing worth in something they didn't understand. It wasn't silence that hurt most. It was the dismissal. They didn't ask questions. They didn't lean in with curiosity. They didn't want to know how I had done it, how many nights I'd worked until 2 a.m, how I'd risked my savings twice to make payroll, how I'd learned to manage people and doubt and taxes and exhaustion. They didn't see the weight of it, the victory of it. To them, it was just marketing, and I was just Haley. I excused myself soon after, walked down to the dock, and sat with my feet in the water for a long time. The envelope sat on the veranda table, untouched, fluttering slightly in the breeze like something forgotten, something no one had asked for. That evening, after the dinner plates were cleared and most of the guests had wandered off to the living room or back porch, I stepped out onto the front lawn to get some air. The cicadas were louder now, a steady summer hum layered over the occasional murmur of voices from inside the house. I wasn't looking for anything, really just space. Space to shake off the weight of the day and the hollow way my gift had landed with my parents. I was heading back inside when I heard voices coming from the garage. The door was half open and the lights were on. I paused, intending to keep walking until I heard my name. Zach's voice was unmistakable, casual, familiar, a little smug. He was talking to our father. They stood side by side near the workbench, half lit by the hanging bulb above them. I stayed just outside the threshold, motionless, not even sure why. Maybe I wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe I already knew what I was about to hear. They were laughing, not cruelly, not maliciously, just easily, the way people do when they're comfortable saying things they know won't be challenged. Zach was joking about my business, calling it a cute phase, something I'd get out of my system once I found something more stable. He suggested I start a blog, something for women, light and fun, like skincare tips or lifestyle journaling. Or maybe, he said, I could help Mom with her church events. He added that I'd always been good at folding bulletins and arranging flowers. Then he said the thing that stuck in my mind long after everything else faded. He said I had a permanent ambition crisis, like it was a running joke, like it was who I was. My father chuckled in response and said something about how some people just aren't built for pressure. That not everyone's cut out for business, that I was probably happier doing something creative as long as someone else handled the real work. I stood there, frozen, listening to them speak about me like I wasn't flesh and blood, like I was some concept they'd long since agreed upon and filed away, It wasn't just what they said, it was the ease with which they said it. The certainty, the absolute lack of hesitation or complexity in how they saw me. I walked away before they saw me. Upstairs in the guest room, I shut the door softly, sat down at the desk, and opened my laptop. My hands were trembling not with rage, but with something colder, a clarity I hadn't wanted. I opened the folder labeled Personal. Inside was a file I hadn't touched in weeks, the proposal draft for a complete brand overhaul and marketing strategy for a car-sharing startup in Los Angeles, a big one. One I'd been pursuing for nearly a year. It was the kind of deal that didn't just boost revenue, it changed the shape of a company. I stared at the numbers, the visuals, the framework I'd built piece by piece over months of planning. I'd written every slide, designed every mock-up, shaped the voice and positioning from the ground up. I knew this project inside out, and if the client accepted the latest revisions, it would double our annual revenue. I had been waiting for the right moment to send it. Now I knew. The right moment wasn't about timing or perfection or being noticed. It was about remembering that what I'd built was real, no matter who couldn't see it. Their failure to understand didn't make it any less valid. I hit send. Then I sat in the dark for a long time, the screen still glowing, my jaw tight and my shoulders still. Whatever they thought I was, I had just proven them wrong. They just didn't know it yet. Sunday arrived heavy with sun and ceremony. The air outside was thick with heat, the kind that made even the lake look tired. Inside, the house buzzed with guests more than I remembered from previous years. Cousins I hadn't seen in a decade, old business partners of my father, neighbors who had no real connection but liked being close to proximity and power. Everyone wore their best linen or polo shirts, balancing glasses of sweet tea and small plates, laughing with that hollow ease that lives at family events like this. At precisely 2 o'clock, my father called everyone into the great room. The space was arranged for the occasion chairs in loose circles, windows open to let in light and breeze, though the latter never arrived. A side table held a tray of iced drinks and a stack of printed programs that looked like something from a wedding, complete with the Carson family crest in gold foil. It was absurd, but no one questioned it. My father stood in front of the fireplace, flanked by Zach and my mother. He wore his navy blazer, the one reserved for church and fundraisers, and spoke with the voice he used at Chamber of Commerce events, measured, proud, deliberate. He welcomed everyone, thanked them for their presence, spoke of family, of legacy, of the values that built Carson Auto into the cornerstone of this community. Then he turned to Zach. He described Zach as a born leader, a man of grit and vision, someone who had embraced responsibility with maturity beyond his years. He spoke about the future, about continuity, about the importance of placing the family's name in capable hands. Zach stood beside him, straight-backed and glowing under the praise like a favored quarterback under stadium lights. My mother looked at him with open pride, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The announcement followed. My father declared to resounding applause that as of this month, a significant portion of Carson Auto's shares would transfer to Zach. He spoke about mentorship and succession and how proud he was to formalize this new chapter. There was no mention of paperwork, of timing, of business structure. It didn't matter. The point had been made. The symbolism was enough. The son had been chosen. The future had been sealed. I clapped. I had to. Everyone did. And then a voice from the back, an aunt or maybe a neighbor, someone too far removed to know better, called out asking what role I would play in this new chapter. I watched the moment land like a stone in a still pond, the ripple of attention turning my father's way. He smiled. Not cruelly, not coldly, just easily. He said I had my own path, my own life, that I'd always done things a little differently. He thanked me for being independent, for following my own road. His tone carried the finality of a polite dismissal, the way a teacher might excuse a quiet student from a group activity she was never really part of. The room nodded, someone chuckled, and the conversation shifted back toward Zach. More applause followed. Champagne glasses were raised, toasts were made, the cameras came out. I didn't move. I sat in my chair, hands folded in my lap, smiling faintly, invisible again in a room full of people who had known me since I was a child. I felt like the one chair left empty at the table, the one no one noticed but everyone walked around. Inside, something folded in on itself. Not in sadness, not quite. It was more compact than that, more solid. A tight coil of grief and fury and a bone-deep exhaustion that felt like it had been building for years. It was the weight of being overlooked and talked around, the sting of being publicly minimized by the people who should have known me best. I felt it press against my ribs, settle in my throat, burn behind my eyes, and I realized in that moment I was done. Not just hurt, not just disappointed done. There would be no more reaching for seats at tables where I was never welcome. No more hoping that clarity would eventually come to people determined to remain blind. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just in them. It was in me. I left that same evening just after the sun dipped below the tree line and the heat began to lose its grip on the air. The house was still full of voices and laughter, more toasts being made, plates being passed. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I didn't say goodbye. I moved through the side hallway, down the service steps, and out the back like a guest sneaking out of a party that had never truly welcomed me. I tossed my bag into the back seat of my old Chevy and started the engine. The gravel crackled beneath the tires as I pulled away from the house, headlights sweeping briefly over the hedges before the driveway curved and swallowed them whole. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. The road to Austin stretched ahead in silence, broken only by the low hum of the car and the occasional ping of my phone. First it was my mother, then my father's sister, probably sent to soften the moment, to be the voice of reason and reunion. The screen lit up again and again with texts I didn't open and calls I didn't answer. I knew what they would say, or at least how they would say it too little, too late, wrapped in politeness or passive concern. I didn't have the energy to decode it anymore. I didn't cry on the way home. Not once. It surprised me at first. I had expected tears, or at least that familiar ache in the chest that came from being overlooked, dismissed, erased, but there was none of that. Only a strange stillness, a clarity that settled over me like dusk. I wasn't leaving out of rage or despair. I was simply done waiting to be noticed, done measuring my worth against someone else's understanding of success, done hoping for a version of family that did not exist in the way I had always needed it to. When I reached Austin, I didn't go home. I drove straight to my office. The city lights shimmered quietly as I pulled into the small lot beside our building. It was nearly midnight, but the air was still warm, the pavement still radiating the heat of the day. I unlocked the front door, stepped into the quiet hum of machines on standby, and made my way to my desk. Everything was exactly as I had left it, organized, focused, waiting. I sat down, opened the folder on my computer labeled LA Project, and printed the final version of the proposal. The papers came out smooth, hot, and final. I signed the contract. Then I scanned it, attached it to an email, typed the recipient's name, and hit send. That was it. No ceremony, no witnesses. Just me, a signature, and the quiet certainty that something had just shifted. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't defiance. It was simply the beginning of a different life. One where I no longer waited to be chosen. One where I no longer asked for permission to exist fully. That moment, sitting alone in a dim office in the middle of a quiet city, was the first time I truly felt free. 3 months passed, though it felt both faster and heavier than time usually moved. In that span, everything shifted not just in the numbers, though those had changed too, but in the air around me, in the way I walked into rooms, in the way I started saying yes to things I used to defer. The new client from Los Angeles had proven to be more than a contract. It was a turning point. The exposure we gained from that single deal rippled outward like a dropped stone in still water. Word spread, referrals came, our campaigns were picked up by regional news outlets, and for the first time, companies reached out to us instead of the other way around. By the end of that quarter, I had enough cash flow and stability to sign a lease on a second office in Dallas. It wasn't flashy, just a modest space in a renovated brick building with good windows and better energy, but it was ours. I brought on 3 new employees and promoted one of my earliest hires to head the expansion. She cried when I told her. I almost did too. My team started showing up on panels. They were invited to speak at conferences in Austin, Houston, and beyond. I sat in the audience once and watched one of my junior strategists speak with such clarity and confidence that I forgot she had once been too afraid to pitch during meetings. That was the kind of growth I couldn't put in a press kit. We were cited in trade publications, a small mention in a Forbes roundup, a glowing review in a Texas business magazine. Nothing massive, but enough to be seen, enough to start a different conversation around our name. Then came the podcast. It was called Women Who Build, and the host reached out to me through a mutual contact. I hesitated at first, not because I didn't have a story to tell, but because I wasn't sure how much I was ready to say out loud. But something inside me knew the time had come. I spoke plainly without dramatics about the years I spent trying to earn approval that never came, about building a business in silence, about the loneliness of carrying ambition in a family that mistook it for rebellion. I didn't name names. I didn't have to. When the episode aired, something happened that I hadn't expected. People wrote to me, women from all over, some from Texas, some from the coasts, a few from overseas. They sent long, honest messages, stories of being overlooked, talked over, redirected toward smaller dreams. Stories of being told they were too much or not enough, sometimes in the same sentence. Stories of choosing themselves anyway. They thanked me, but I wanted to thank them. Because for the first time, I felt part of something bigger. Not a family legacy I was born into, but a community I had built through choice, through resilience, through truth. It wasn't just a different chapter, it was a different book entirely, and I was finally the one holding the pen. In November, when the days turned shorter and the air held that unmistakable Texas crispness, I received a call that surprised me more than I admitted at the time. It was Jake, an old friend from high school, someone who had stayed loosely tethered to both Zach and me over the years. We weren't close, but there had always been a mutual respect, especially after we both landed in careers that required late nights and early mornings. Jake worked in commercial banking and had once tried to help Zach secure financing for a dealership expansion. I hadn't spoken to him in months, so when his name flashed on my phone, I hesitated before answering, unsure if it was business, nostalgia, or something in between. He didn't waste time. He said he'd been hearing things my name, mostly. In circles he didn't expect. Business circles, real ones. Apparently, some of the companies I'd worked with had banked through his firm, and my name had come up more than once. Strategic, scalable, creative. It wasn't praise for the sake of flattery. It was the kind of language people used when money moved. He told me my father had been asking questions. Quiet ones, the kind asked at the end of a meeting or over coffee with a colleague. Nothing dramatic, just a simple wondering. Maybe it was time to rethink their marketing strategy. Maybe digital wasn't a phase. Maybe they needed someone with a fresh perspective. Maybe someone like me. I sat still as he said it, my fingers wrapped around a warm mug of tea, my mind somewhere between disbelief and detached amusement. I wasn't flattered, I wasn't angry, I just felt a sense of ironic symmetry. For years I had tried to bring my ideas to that table. Now, suddenly the table had legs that wobbled without me. Then Jake told me something else, almost as an afterthought. He said Zach had admitted quietly and without much fanfare that he hadn't expected me to make it this far, that he thought I'd give up, or scale back, or settle for something small. But that I'd surprised him. Those were the words he used, not praise, not an apology, just acknowledgement wrapped in surprise. I smiled then, not out of vindication, but something calmer, like standing on a ridge and looking down at the place you once struggled to climb out of. I didn't need Zach's approval. I hadn't for a long time, but hearing that he had finally run out of reasons to dismiss me, that was something. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't a victory speech. It was a quiet echo from the past, confirming what I already knew. I had changed, and they had noticed. My mother called again. It was early December, and the cold had finally settled into Austin in that rare way it does, tentative but present. I saw her name on the screen and almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Maybe it was the softness in her voice. There was a quiet hesitancy I hadn't heard before, like she was reaching out with open hands instead of holding a script. She said my father wanted to see me. She didn't explain why, and I didn't ask. There was no dramatic pause, no emotional plea, just a suggestion, a hope that I might consider meeting him. I told her I would. We agreed to meet at my office. I chose the location deliberately. It was neutral, yes, but also mine. It was the place where I felt grounded, where my work spoke for itself. If this conversation was going to happen, it would happen where I no longer needed to prove anything. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, dressed in a collared shirt and a jacket I hadn't seen before. He looked older than I remembered, more than just the passing of time. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or the way his eyes lingered on the building, the signage, the details. I gave him a short tour. I didn't over-explain. I let him see the space as it was. He walked past the open concept desks, nodded at the whiteboard filled with strategy plans, paused by the wall of client logos. He shook hands with my operations manager. He looked around the conference room where we held Monday huddles and campaign debriefs. I could see it on his face. He hadn't imagined this. He sat with me for 15 minutes in my glass-walled office, looking out over the modest skyline. He said he hadn't realized how far I'd come, that he had underestimated what I was building, that he'd thought I was chasing a hobby, not a business. He used the word impressive once and serious twice. Then he said he was proud quietly, as if testing how it sounded in his own mouth. I listened. I nodded, but I didn't let it sink too deep. It felt less like an apology and more like a recalibration, the kind people make when they realize the old version of a story no longer fits the facts. He wasn't apologizing for the past. He was acknowledging the present. And that was fine. I thanked him. I told him I appreciated the visit. But I didn't offer more than that. I didn't reach for something warmer or more complete. I didn't invite him to lunch or ask how the dealership was doing. I didn't try to fill the silence that settled between us after the compliments faded, because I didn't need his recognition anymore, not like I used to. He left with a handshake and a nod, and I stood at the window as he walked back to his car, paused, and looked once more at the building. Then he drove off. I turned back to my desk, opened my laptop, and returned to work. It was just another Tuesday, and I was already whole. That Christmas, I didn't go to Lake Travis. I didn't pack a weekend bag or bake something to bring or pretend that everything had somehow changed. I made a quiet decision weeks before. I would stay home. And not just stay, I would make new plans, different ones that reflected the life I had now, not the one I kept trying to fit into. I hosted a holiday lunch at the office. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm. We ordered catering from a local spot everyone loved, with big trays of food and pitchers of sweet tea and cider. We pushed the desks to the walls and set up folding tables covered in mismatched tablecloths and holiday paper runners that looked better in the dark than in daylight. There were candles, laughter. Someone brought their dog, which barked once during the gift exchange and then fell asleep under the dessert table. We gave each other books. No assigned gifts, no secret Santa stress, just something that mattered to you this year. That rule made it better, personal, thoughtful. I received a copy of a novel I'd once mentioned in passing during a late-night brainstorm session, and the person who gave it to me said, "This made me think of you." I couldn't remember the last time a gift had felt like that, like someone had truly seen me. We sat on the floor and leaned against file cabinets and talked about everything but work, travel plans, childhood Christmas disasters, what we used to believe in and what we hoped for now. It wasn't polished, it wasn't curated for public approval, but it felt honest, and it felt like mine. At one point, I stepped into my office to refill my drink and paused by the window. Outside, traffic rolled steadily down South Congress. People walked past in coats and scarves, carrying shopping bags, pulling children along behind them. Cars idled at the light, headlights soft and yellow against the gray of winter. I caught my reflection in the glass, not just my face, but everything behind me too. The room still filled with voices. The little tree we decorated, the stack of books on my desk, the team I'd built. And I thought, with a calm that surprised me, that I never would have gotten here without the rejection. Not just the silence and the dismissals and the subtle humiliations, but the deep, persistent ache of not being accepted. It had pushed me, shaped me, sharpened me. It had made me strong, not hard, resilient, not bitter. It had given me clarity about where I belonged, what I deserved, and what I would never settle for again. That realization didn't come with fireworks or tears, just a quiet settling inside me, like a stone finding the bottom of a lake. I turned away from the window and went back to join my team. There was still cake to be served, there were still stories to be told, there was still more to build, and for the first time on a holiday, I didn't feel like I was missing anything. 6 months later, I flew to Chicago for a business conference. It wasn't my first time speaking at an event, but this one felt different. The invitation had come with a personal note from the organizers. They'd heard my podcast interview and wanted me to close the second day of the conference with a keynote titled Building a Career Alone: What Happens When No One Believes in You. I stared at the title for a long time before accepting. It felt vulnerable. It also felt true. The conference was held in a glass high-rise overlooking the river, the kind with polished lobbies and tall, echoing ceilings. I wore a simple black suit and carried no notes. I had rehearsed the talk, yes, but not to memorize it. I knew the story by heart because I had lived every inch of it. I stepped onto the stage to polite applause and a sea of faces, some curious, some distracted, some expectant. I began slowly, not with statistics or a pitch, but with a question. What do you do when no one claps for you at the beginning? When no one opens the door or even tells you where the door is? I let the silence hang for a second before sharing the first part of my story, the years of trying, the long climb, the feeling of always being too much or not enough depending on who was watching. I spoke about building my business without investors, without family backing, without inherited networks, about pitching clients who didn't take me seriously until they saw results, about the nights I couldn't sleep wondering if the risk was worth it. I told them how I learned to be my own validator, my own advocate, my own compass. But I also told them about joy, about what it feels like when your first hire calls you a mentor, when a campaign you built helps a small business stay afloat, when you walk into your own office and see a team you assembled from scratch laughing over coffee before a meeting. I ended with something simple. That success built in silence still counts. That applause after the fact still echoes. When I finished, the room stood. Not instantly, not all at once, but gradually, in that honest, unscripted way that tells you something landed. I took a breath and thanked them, and as the moderator stepped in, I stepped down. A young woman approached me as I left the stage, maybe 20, maybe a few years younger. She wore jeans and a blazer 2 sizes too big and clutched a worn notebook like it was armor. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "That was my story. You just told my story." Her voice didn't shake, but her hands did. I smiled, and it wasn't just gratitude. It was recognition. I saw myself in her, the younger version, the one who kept showing up even when the room didn't notice. I told her I believed in her, not because I knew her, but because I understood what it took to stand where she was standing. Later, as I looked out from my hotel room over the lights of the city, I thought about how far I had come. Not just in miles or revenue or reputation, but in identity. I was no longer someone's daughter or someone's sister or someone quietly trying to earn a place. I was my own, not a reflection, not a shadow, my own light. And for the first time in my life, that didn't feel like a quiet hope. It felt like truth.